The ridge that forged a nation. The Battle of Vimy Ridge, early 1917. World War I is locked in a brutal, grinding stalemate. For over 2.5 years, the Western Front has been a horrifying, blood-soaked ditch carved across northern France and Belgium. Millions of men are trapped in a maze of trenches that stretches from the Swiss border to the English Channel. Over 400 miles of hell on earth. The mud is knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep. It sucks at your boots with every step, threatening to swallow you whole. Men have drowned in shell craters filled with liquid mud. The air reeks of cordite, poison gas, and the sweet, sick smell of decay. Bodies, thousands of them, lie in no man's land, rotting where they fell because recovering them means certain death. And everywhere, day and night, the constant thunder of artillery. A sound so relentless that men who survived the war would hear it in their dreams for decades. But one particular stretch of land, a seemingly insignificant rise in the landscape of northern France, had become something more than just another piece of the front line. This was Vimy Ridge, 7 kilometers long, rising 145 meters above the surrounding plains. And it had become a graveyard for Allied ambitions, a fortress that had swallowed countless lives. A position deemed utterly, completely, and impossibly impregnable. For France, Vimy Ridge was a wound that wouldn't heal. A national humiliation written in blood, dominating the flat plains of Artois like a predator overlooking its hunting ground. The ridge offered an unparalleled view of Allied positions for miles in every direction. From its heights, German artillery spotters could direct devastating fire on anything that moved below. They could see supply convoys coming from 10 miles away. They could call down shells on troop movements before those troops even knew they'd been spotted. The ridge wasn't just a defensive position, it was a weapon in itself. Time and again, French forces had hurled themselves against it. In 1914, during the opening months of the war, they attacked with the kind of elan and courage that had defined French military doctrine for generations. They were cut down in their thousands. In May 1915, they tried again during the Second Battle of Artois. Over 100,000 French casualties in 6 weeks. The ridge didn't budge, they called it the meat grinder. French mothers called it a nightmare. By the end of 1916, the French had lost over 150,000 men trying to take Vimy Ridge. 150,000. Fathers, sons, brothers. An entire generation of young men from Brittany, Provence, Normandy, gone. And for what? The bodies of French soldiers still lay frozen in the mud and wire, skeletal hands reaching toward a hill they would never climb. The ridge had earned its reputation. It was considered impregnable, a fortress that couldn't be broken by courage alone. Why was it so formidable? Because the Germans understood exactly what they had. They had transformed the ridge into an absolute fortress, a masterpiece of military engineering. We're talking 3 complete lines of trenches, each one deeper and more sophisticated than the last. Concrete bunkers with walls 2 meters thick that could withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. Deep dugouts carved 40 feet into the chalk, connected by tunnels, where entire companies of men could shelter during bombardments. Some of these underground complexes had multiple levels, electric lighting, ventilation systems, even running water. They were fortresses beneath a fortress, and protecting it all, vast fields of barbed wire stretching hundreds of yards deep. Not the simple farm wire you might imagine. This was industrial-strength steel cable, twisted into vicious spirals, stacked in belts 10 feet high and 50 yards deep. Try to cut through it, and machine guns would cut through you. Machine gun nests were perfectly positioned to cover every inch of approach. Interlocking fields of fire meant there was literally no safe route forward. Move left, you're in one machine gun's sights. Move right, you're in another's. Stand still. Artillery will find you. It wasn't just a position. It was a death trap, engineered with German precision and tested with French blood. And then, in late 1916, the sector was handed over to a new formation, a corps that most British and French officers viewed with barely concealed skepticism. These were colonials, enthusiastic amateurs, men who had never seen a real war until they arrived in France. These were the Canadians. Now here's what makes this story remarkable. When World War I began in August 1914, Canada wasn't even a fully independent nation. Britain declared war, and Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war. They had no say in the matter, and Canada's standing army at the outbreak of war, 3,000 men, 3,000 in a country of 8 million people. But something extraordinary happened. Within weeks of the declaration, over 30,000 men volunteered. By 1917, the Canadian Expeditionary Force numbered over 600,000 men. The Canadian Corps alone, 4 full divisions, fielded over 100,000 troops. This was an army that hadn't existed 3 years earlier, and they came from everywhere. These weren't just Canadians in the traditional sense. They were men from every walk of life, from all corners of the Commonwealth and beyond, united under the maple leaf. Farmers from the wheat fields of Alberta and Saskatchewan who knew hard work and harsh winters. Loggers from British Columbia, men used to dangerous physical labor. Factory workers from Ontario and Quebec, miners from Nova Scotia. Recent immigrants from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, men who'd left the old country for a new life, only to find themselves fighting for both. Indigenous soldiers from First Nations across Canada, many of whom weren't even considered full citizens but volunteered anyway. There were university students and dock workers, bank clerks and fishermen. Most had never fired a rifle before enlisting. Many had never been more than 50 miles from their homes. Now they were in France, looking at a ridge that had broken the French army. But here's the thing about the Canadian Corps by early 1917. They had been forged in the furnace of the Western Front's worst battles. They'd fought at Ypres in 1915, where they'd faced the first German poison gas attack and held the line when other units broke. They'd endured the hell of the Somme in 1916. They'd learned the hard way, paid in blood for every lesson, but they'd learned. They weren't amateurs anymore. They were veterans, hard, professional, and increasingly confident in their own abilities. And they were about to attempt what many thought impossible, take Vimy Ridge, but they wouldn't do it the old way. They wouldn't throw themselves at German machine guns in suicidal waves, hoping courage would overcome firepower. They would do it with a plan unlike anything seen before. A plan that would revolutionize modern warfare. The Canadian Corps was commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng, a British officer from an aristocratic family, a career soldier who had fought in colonial wars across the empire. Byng was traditional in many ways, but he had one crucial quality. He was willing to embrace new ideas, and he trusted his subordinates. He didn't micromanage. He set the objectives and let his division commanders figure out how to achieve them. But the real tactical innovation, the revolutionary thinking that would define Vimy, came from officers like Arthur Currie. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie commanded the 1st Canadian Division. And Currie's story is important because it tells you everything about why the Canadian approach was different. Currie was not a professional soldier. Before the war, he was a real estate dealer in Victoria, British Columbia. A businessman, a militia officer who drilled one weekend a month. When war broke out, he was nearly 40 years old, overweight, and deeply in debt. He had no formal military education, no staff college training, no aristocratic connections. Everything he knew about warfare, he'd learned by studying, by reading, by observing, and most importantly, by caring deeply about the men under his command. And Arthur Currie believed one thing absolutely: soldiers' lives should not be thrown away in reckless charges. Every attack had to be carefully calculated, thoroughly rehearsed, and backed by overwhelming firepower. Violence should be precise, coordinated, and devastating. You don't win by dying bravely. You win by making the other poor bastard die for his country, as Patton would later say. This philosophy, championed by Currie and other Canadian commanders, permeated the entire Corps. It shaped everything about the plan for Vimy, and it was about to prove that wars could be won by thinking, not just by dying. The blueprint for victory. The Canadians knew that attacking the German fortress head-on would be suicide. They'd watched the French try it. They'd seen the results. So they developed a blueprint for victory, and that blueprint was founded on 3 revolutionary ideas that would change warfare forever. First, intelligence and knowledge. Instead of relying on fragmented reports and guesswork, the Canadian Corps embarked on the most detailed intelligence operation yet attempted in the war. Using over 40,000 photographic plates taken from reconnaissance aircraft, Brave pilots flying slow, vulnerable planes over German lines, they created detailed, three-dimensional models of the entire German trench system. Every machine gun nest was mapped, every concrete bunker measured and marked, every strand of barbed wire fence accounted for, artillery positions identified, communication trenches traced. The Canadians built full-scale replicas of the German defenses behind their own lines. Soldiers trained on these mock-ups until they knew the German positions better than the Germans themselves. Officers and NCOs walked the training grounds with maps in hand until they could navigate the attack route blindfolded. They practiced advancing over and over, each unit responsible for specific objectives, each man knowing exactly where he needed to be and when. But here's what made it truly revolutionary. What British and French commanders couldn't believe. Every single soldier, from private to general, was briefed on the entire plan. Think about that. In 1917, this was unheard of, radical, almost scandalous. In the British and French armies, soldiers were mushrooms, kept in the dark and fed shit. They were told to go where they were pointed and not ask questions. Tactics were secret, known only to officers. The average soldier knew nothing beyond follow orders and don't die. But at Vimy, every man knew not just his own objective, but the objectives of the units to his left and right. He knew the overall goal. He understood the timing. If his officer fell, and officers died first, leading from the front, the next man, a sergeant or even a private, could step up and continue the advance. He wouldn't freeze. He wouldn't retreat. He'd know what needed to be done and do it. This democratization of tactical knowledge transformed the Canadian Corps into a thinking army. An army where initiative lived at every level, where decisions could be made in the chaos of battle by the men on the ground, not just by officers miles behind the lines. One Canadian private wrote home, "They trust us. They actually trust us to know what we're doing. We're not just cannon fodder anymore, we're soldiers." For decades, trench warfare was defined by a brutal, unsolvable problem. How do you cross 200 yards of open ground, straight into machine guns firing 600 rounds a minute? The old method was simple. Fire thousands of artillery shells at the enemy until everything stops moving, then send in the infantry. But this never worked. German soldiers would simply wait out the storm in deep concrete shelters, 30 or 40 feet underground, where shells couldn't reach. When the barrage lifted, and it always lifted before an attack, because you can't shell your own men, they would rush up from their dugouts, man their machine guns, and mow down the advancing infantry in no man's land. This grim cycle repeated itself thousands of times, but in 1917, the Canadians arrived with a plan. They didn't just bring more guns, they brought science. First, they pioneered the predicted barrage. Traditionally, gunners fired ranging shots to zero in on a target, but these test shots acted like a dinner bell, warning the Germans an attack was imminent. The Canadians changed this. Using advanced mathematics, they calibrated every single gun, like their 18-pounders and 6-inch howitzers, with incredible precision. They factored in wind speed, air temperature, barrel wear, even the rotation of the Earth. This meant they could calculate exactly where every shell would land, without firing a single warning shot. The bombardment would begin with absolute surprise and devastating accuracy. Second, they introduced the fuse 106. Standard shells had a delay, burrowing into the ground before exploding. This was useless against barbed wire and left deep dugouts untouched. The fuse 106 was different. It was an instantaneous percussion fuse. The moment it touched anything, even a single strand of wire, it exploded. The blast ripped sideways, shredding barbed wire to pieces. More importantly, it sprayed shrapnel horizontally, right at head height, across the entrances of trenches and dugouts. Imagine being a German soldier, huddled 30 feet underground. You've survived bombardments before, but this one sounds different. Sharper. The explosions are happening right at the surface. You try to climb out, but a wall of red-hot steel is tearing through the air at the dugout entrance. You are trapped, pinned down in your own fortress. For weeks leading up to the attack on Vimy Ridge, Canadian artillery unleashed what the Germans called drum fire, a continuous deafening roar that never stopped. Over 1 million shells were fired, a sound so immense it was heard in London, 130 miles away. The Germans reinforced their lines, expecting another futile, bloody assault. They had no idea they were facing a revolution in warfare, a storm of perfectly calculated steel. They were wrong.
Act 3. The eve of battle. The night before the attack, April 8, 1917, was cold and miserable. Sleet mixed with freezing rain. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Men huddled in trenches and in the tunnels below, making their final preparations. They checked their equipment: rifle, bayonet, 18 inches of steel sharpened to a wicked point. Ammunition, 120 rounds. Grenades, Mills bombs, each one a small cast-iron pineapple of death. Water bottle, emergency rations, hardtack biscuits that could break teeth, and a tin of bully beef. Entrenching tool, wire cutters, gas mask, field dressings. Some men carried extra gear: Lewis gun magazines, mortar shells, Bangalore torpedoes for blowing wire. They wrote letters home. Thousands of letters. Some matter of fact: "Don't worry, Mum, I'll be fine." Others more honest: "If you're reading this, I didn't make it. Tell Mary I loved her, take care of the kids." Many of these letters would be mailed in the coming days by comrades. Too many. Some men made quiet promises to each other. "If I go down, get my watch to my brother. Make sure my mother gets my pay. If you see me hit, keep going. Don't stop for me." These were the grim, practical arrangements of men who knew the odds. Others tried to sleep, but sleep was impossible. The artillery bombardment was continuous, a rolling thunder that shook the earth. Some men welcomed the noise. It meant the guns were still protecting them. Others found it maddening. There was nervous humor, dark jokes. "Remember, the Germans are more scared of us than we are of them." Probably not true, but it's a nice thought. "If I die, you can have my rum ration. When this is over, first thing I'm doing is sleeping for a week." Some men prayed. Quietly, self-consciously, but earnestly. Catholics crossed themselves and fingered rosaries. Protestants recited the Lord's Prayer. Jewish soldiers murmured the Shema. It didn't matter that they'd probably never see the inside of a church or synagogue again after this was over. Right now, faith was something to hold on to. Lieutenant Edward Bellew of the 8th Battalion walked among his men that night, making sure they were as ready as anyone could be. Years later, he would write, "I looked at their faces in the flickering light of the braziers. Boys, most of them. Farm boys and city boys who 6 months earlier had been working in shops or plowing fields. Now they were checking grenades and sharpening bayonets like veterans. I wondered how many would be alive tomorrow night. I tried not to show my fear because they were looking to me for confidence. But inside, I was terrified. Not of dying, I'd made my peace with that, but of failing them. Of making a mistake that would get them killed." Around 3 a.m., the rum ration was issued. A tot of Royal Navy rum, harsh and burning, issued to steady nerves before battle. It was technically against regulations to give alcohol to soldiers before an attack, but everyone looked the other way. Some men refused it, wanted clear heads. Others drank deep, grateful for the warmth and the temporary courage. At 4 a.m., the order came down: "Fix bayonets." The metallic click of steel locking onto rifle barrels echoed through the trenches. That sound, unmistakable, final, marked the point of no return. Bayonets weren't for show. They were for killing at close quarters, for the brutal work of trench clearing. Once bayonets were fixed, you were committed. There was no turning back. Men climbed the ladders out of the trenches and lay down in no man's land, forming up in waves. 4 waves per division, each one carefully spaced. The front wave would hit the German first line. The second wave would leapfrog through and hit the second line. Third and fourth waves would consolidate and move supplies forward. They lay in the mud and sleet, waiting for 0 hour. Waiting for the mines to blow, waiting for the barrage to lift. Waiting for the whistles that would send them forward into history. Some men tried to stay warm. Others tried to stay calm. A few actually dozed off from sheer exhaustion. Most just waited, watching the luminous dials of their synchronized watches as the minutes crawled toward 5:30 a.m. In the tunnels below, thousands more men waited in the electric light, smoking cigarettes, playing cards, trying to distract themselves. The tunnels would empty at 0 hour, disgorging battalions directly into the German trenches through exits that had been dug right up to the German wire. Officers checked their watches obsessively. Artillery officers stood by their guns, ready to begin the creeping barrage. Engineers stood by the detonators for the mines, waiting for the exact second to blow them. Everything was ready. Over 100,000 men, nearly 1,000 guns, months of planning, weeks of preparation. All coming down to a few hours on a cold April morning. Easter Monday, 1917, the day that would change everything. 8/4, the storm breaks. At precisely 5:30 a.m., the earth erupted. 19 massive mines detonated simultaneously along a 7-kilometer front. The largest contained over 20 tons of explosives. The blasts were felt 20 miles away. Soldiers on both sides described it as the earth itself convulsing. Entire sections of the German front line simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant. Massive plumes of chalk, dirt, rock, and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air, blotting out the pre-dawn sky. German soldiers in the affected areas had no chance. Some were killed instantly by the blast. Others were buried alive as their dugouts collapsed. Those who survived staggered out into a nightmare. And then, before the debris had even settled, nearly 1,000 Canadian artillery pieces opened fire in perfect synchronization. The noise was beyond description. Not just loud, reality-altering. A physical force that hit you in the chest, that made your bones vibrate, that turned the air itself into a weapon. Soldiers who lived through it said you couldn't hear individual explosions. It blended into one continuous roar, like standing inside a waterfall of sound. Men screamed orders at each other from inches away, couldn't be heard. Some men's eardrums burst from the pressure. Others bled from their noses. The German defensive line disappeared under a curtain of explosions. High explosive shells, shrapnel shells, gas shells, smoke shells, all falling in a precisely calculated pattern, walking forward at 100 yards every 3 minutes. And behind that wall of fire and steel, the Canadian Corps attacked. Not in a wild charge, not screaming and running, but in steady, disciplined waves, walking forward through the sleet and smoke, keeping exact pace with the barrage. Each man maintaining his position, his spacing, his timing, like a machine, like death itself made orderly and inevitable. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd divisions, responsible for the heavily fortified central and southern slopes, advanced with devastating efficiency. Their synchronized advance behind the creeping barrage worked exactly as planned. German defenders who had survived the initial bombardment, and many had, deep in their concrete bunkers, emerged expecting to see attacking infantry still hundreds of yards away. Instead, Canadians were already in their trenches. The fighting was vicious and close. Bayonets, grenades, entrenching tools used as weapons, pistols fired at point-blank range. This wasn't the romantic warfare of cavalry charges. This was industrial-age killing, brutal and impersonal. Men fought and died in narrow trenches, in concrete bunkers, in shell craters filled with icy water. But the Canadians had the advantage of surprise, momentum, and overwhelming firepower. More importantly, they had the training. Every man knew his job. When officers fell, and many did, because they led from the front, making them primary targets, sergeants took over. When sergeants fell, corporals stepped up. When corporals fell, privates who knew the plan kept the attack moving. Private William Johnstone Milne of the 16th Battalion, Canadian-Scottish, was in the first wave attacking the German positions near a fortified point called Hill 145, the highest point on the ridge. His company came under devastating fire from multiple German machine gun nests that had survived the barrage. These guns, perfectly positioned and expertly manned, were cutting down Canadians before they could get close. Milne saw his company pinned down, men dying in the open. Without orders, without hesitation, he crawled forward through a hail of machine gun fire. Bullets kicked up dirt all around him. Men to his left and right were hit. But Milne kept crawling. He got close enough to the first machine gun nest to throw grenades. The position went silent. He moved to the second nest. More grenades. More Germans killed or wounded. The survivors surrendered. He moved to a third position. By now, the Germans knew he was coming. They concentrated their fire on him, specifically. He was hit multiple times, but he kept moving forward, kept fighting, until he had silenced enough machine gun positions for his company to advance. Only then did he collapse. He died minutes later, but his actions had saved dozens of lives and allowed the attack to continue. William Milne was 24 years old. He would be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the British Empire's highest award for valor. His citation read simply, "Conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty." But those words don't capture what he did. He saw what needed to be done and did it, knowing it would cost him his life because it was the only way to save his comrades. Stories like Milne's played out across the ridge, individual acts of courage that made the difference between success and failure. Soldiers going beyond training, beyond duty, because the men beside them depended on it. Within 2 hours, the crucial parts of the German defensive line had fallen. By 7:30 a.m., Canadian troops stood on Hill 145, the highest point of Vimy Ridge. They looked out over the Douai Plains for the first time in years. The view that had belonged to Germany since 1914 was now Canadian. Soldiers later described the moment with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Sergeant Victor Wheeler of the 50th Battalion wrote, "We stood on top of the ridge, and you could see for miles, villages, roads, German positions that had been invisible from below. And we realized we'd actually done it. We'd taken the ridge. After all those French lives, after everyone said it couldn't be done, we'd bloody well done it." But the battle wasn't over. The 4th Canadian Division, commanded by Major General David Watson, faced the toughest resistance at the northern end of the ridge, centered on a fortified section known as the Pimple. This section jutted out from the main ridgeline, protected by a sudden drop that made it difficult to hit with artillery. The Germans had concentrated their defenses here, knowing it was the key to the entire northern flank. The initial assault on the Pimple on April 9th was repulsed. The Germans here were veteran troops, well supplied and determined. Machine gun fire raked the Canadian positions. German artillery, pre-ranged on the approaches, caught the attacking waves in the open. Casualties mounted quickly, but the success of the main assault had secured the Canadian flanks. More artillery was brought up. The bombardment intensified. On April 12th, 3 days after the initial attack, the Canadians tried again. This time, with the lessons of the first assault learned and the full weight of Canadian artillery support, they broke through. The fighting for the Pimple was some of the most brutal of the battle. German counterattacks were fierce and determined. In some places, the trenches changed hands 3 times. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the narrow confines of captured positions. The Germans knew that losing the Pimple meant losing Vimy Ridge entirely, and they threw everything they had into holding it. But the Canadians wouldn't be stopped. By the evening of April 12th, the Pimple was in Canadian hands. The entire ridge, all 7 kilometers of it, was firmly under Allied control for the first time since 1914. It had taken 4 days. 4 days to accomplish what the French couldn't do in 2 years. 4 days to break the fortress that had defined this section of the Western Front. Act 5. The cost and the meaning. The victory at Vimy Ridge was swift and total by the standards of World War I. However, the cost was devastating, just as all great war battles were. In those 4 days, the Canadian Corps suffered 10,602 casualties. Of those, 3,598 were killed outright or died of their wounds. Another 7,004 were wounded, some of whom would die later from infection or complications. Every one of those men had a name, a family, a story, a future that ended on that ridge. Private Thomas McDowell from Lachute, Quebec, 22 years old, killed on the first day. His mother received a telegram, "Regret to inform you." She kept his last letter for the rest of her life. Lance Corporal Frederick Fisher, Victoria Cross winner, was killed at Hill 145. He was 19. Sergeant Robert Spall from Toronto left behind a wife and 2 young daughters. He made it off the ridge but died of his wounds 2 days later in a field hospital. These weren't statistics. These were fathers and sons, brothers and husbands, men who would never see home again, never marry, never have children, never grow old. The Canadian War Memorial at Vimy lists 11,185 names, Canadian soldiers who died in France and have no known grave. Many of them fell at Vimy Ridge and were never found, their bodies lost in the mud and chaos of battle. But for all the terrible cost, Vimy Ridge was a genuine strategic victory, and in the context of World War I, where offensives routinely cost 100,000 lives for a few yards of mud. This was extraordinary. Vimy Ridge was one of the few battles of the Great War that went exactly as planned. Every phase of the operation had succeeded. Every objective had been taken on schedule. It wasn't just a tactical triumph. It was a symbol of what modern, coordinated warfare could achieve when intelligence, science, and courage worked together. But beyond the strategy and the maps, something deeper happened on that ridge. Something that no one could have planned for. Because when the smoke cleared and the Canadians stood atop Vimy Ridge, looking out across the Douai Plains, they weren't just soldiers anymore. They were something larger, something new. For the first time, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps, men from every province, every background, every language, had fought together as one army under Canadian command. And they had succeeded where the great European powers had failed. News of the victory spread quickly back home. In Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Halifax, church bells rang. Newspapers declared it Canada's Easter miracle. Families gathered around radios and read the lists of the wounded and missing. Grief and pride intertwined. Prime Minister Robert Borden said later, "In those few days at Vimy Ridge, Canada came of age and proved itself on the field of battle. It was more than just a battlefield win. It was a defining moment in the country's identity. Before Vimy, Canada had been a dominion, part of the British Empire, proud but peripheral. After Vimy, the world began to see Canada as a nation in its own right. At the peace talks that ended the war, Canada would sign its own name to the Treaty of Versailles, not simply as a British colony, but as an independent participant. And the men who fought there carried that pride for the rest of their lives. Even decades later, when they gathered for reunions, they spoke of Vimy with a reverence reserved for sacred ground. They knew what it had cost, and they knew what it had built.